There's a question they ask every soldier who walks back from somewhere they shouldn't have survived. Not how. Not what happened. Why are you here? It sounds like paperwork. Like a formality some colonel invented to justify the debrief coffee getting cold on his desk. You hear it and you think bureaucracy. You think Form 27B, next window, move along. You don't think this question has teeth. Admiral Graves asked it the way a man asks something he already knows the answer to and is waiting patient, still, almost bored, for you to catch up to him. He asked it across a table that hadn't been wiped down since the last person sat in that chair and bled on it metaphorically. He asked it with his hands folded and his eyes doing the thing eyes do when they've seen enough to stop reacting to new information. I was the one who heard him ask it. I was the one who watched what happened when the soldier across from him didn't answer with words. He answered with his arms. He rolled up his sleeves, slow, the way you do something you've done 10,000 times, mechanical, no theater in it, and he laid them flat on the table. And the Admiral, who had not reacted to a single thing in 40 minutes, went quiet in a way that was different from his regular quiet. There are scars and, then, there are records. That man's arms were records. Dates. Operations. Decisions that got written on skin because there was no other available surface. I've been in rooms where the temperature changed because of what someone said. This was the first time I watched a room change because of what someone showed. What followed was not a debrief. It was a reckoning. And I'm going to tell you all of it because somebody should, and because the official version leaves out the three parts that actually matter. The fluorescent tube above the holding room had been flickering for 6 hours before Staff Sergeant Darius Cole even arrived, and, by the time they brought him in, I had already catalogued the flicker pattern 1.4 seconds on, 0.3 off, repeat the way I catalog everything I cannot control. It's a habit. My CO calls it a neurosis. My therapist, on the 2 occasions I had one, called it hypervigilance with a dash of OCD, which is a polished way of saying I count things when I'm scared and I've been scared for most of the last 4 years. I logged the flicker. I logged the time, 0347 hours. I logged that the coffee in my thermos had gone from scalded to merely offensive, somewhere around the temperature of regret. I did not log that my hands were doing the thing they do. The tapping. 3 fingers on the inside of my thigh, under the table. Soft. Rhythmic. A personal Morse code that translated, roughly, to, something is wrong with this whole situation and, you were sitting in the middle of it, Lieutenant Carver, so try not to breathe funny. They'd pulled me out of the cost rotation for this. No explanation. A Black Hawk to Bagram, a C-17 to Ramstein, a Karg civilian, unmarked, the kind of unmarked that announces itself, to this building, which was the kind of building that didn't have a name on the outside because it didn't need one. Buildings that need names are public. This one was the other kind. Colonel Harwick had met me at the door. He had the look of a man who had been awake for 36 hours and was running on institutional momentum and suppressed fury, jaw tight, eyes doing that shallow focus thing where they land on you but aren't actually seeing you, they're seeing whatever decision is chewing through the back of his brain. You were in Sector 9, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir. During the Oresh Valley push. Yes, sir. Cole was your fire team lead. I paused 1 beat longer than I should have. Yes, sir. Harwick looked at me then. Really looked, the way he did when he was calibrating whether you were going to be useful or a liability. They're bringing him in for a Level 4 review. Admiral Graves is conducting personally. I need someone in the room who was there. Who saw what he did. Who can, he stopped. Chose a different word than whatever he'd been reaching for. Contextualize. Contextualize. What a clean, small word to sit on top of what happened in Oresh. I'd been there 11 weeks. Long enough to stop noticing the smell of the valley, that particular cocktail of dust and diesel and something organic and wrong that I later learned was the river when it ran low, long enough to have opinions about which ration brand tasted least like compressed sadness, not long enough to trust my own instincts about what quiet meant. In Oresh, quiet meant one of 2 things. Either nothing was happening. Or everything was about to. Cole had taught me that. Not in a classroom way. In the way that a person who has been somewhere 4 rotations teaches you things, by already being turned around when you were still figuring out which direction the sound came from. He was 34. Which in that valley felt like 70 in the same way certain cheeses age faster in a wet cellar. Not old. Just dense with experience, compacted, like the life had been pressed into him under serious pressure and come out harder on the other side. He had the kind of face that had stopped being handsome at some specific moment nobody had photographed and was now just authoritative, a face you looked at when you needed to know whether to run or hold. He had a habit. I noted it in the first week. Every time we set up a position, before anything else, before he even unslung his rifle all the way, he'd look at the nearest wall. Floor. Ceiling. Whatever surface. And he'd tap it once with 2 knuckles, just once, like he was checking if it was real. Like he was asking the building's permission. I asked Martinez about it once. Martinez had been with Cole since Fallujah. Martinez just looked at me and went back to cleaning his bolt carrier. Which was, I would later understand, an answer. The night they brought him to Ramstein, he walked in under his own power, which surprised everyone including, I think, the 2 MPs flanking him who'd presumably been told to expect someone on a stretcher or in restraints. He wasn't either. He was in clean BDUs that didn't fit quite right, issued, borrowed from supply, the kind that say your clothes were not available without saying your clothes were evidence. He sat down across from the empty chair where Admiral Graves would eventually be and he looked at the flickering light the same way I had, and I watched him count the pattern. 1.4 on. 0.3 off. His lips moved slightly, which is not a thing most people do when they count, but Cole had never been concerned with what most people did. I was in the observer's booth, one-way glass, the cliché of every interrogation scene, except this wasn't an interrogation, it was a review, which is what you call an interrogation when you're not ready to commit to the word. Harwick was beside me with his coffee, which he held but didn't drink, the mug a prop to give his hands something to do. How bad is it? I said. Also not a question. Harwick did the thing where he breathed through his nose for 4 seconds before responding. 63 dead. Ours, theirs, combination. 7 villages, 2 compromised exfil routes, 1 destroyed FOB, and an acid network in the Kandahar corridor that will take 2 years to rebuild if we start tomorrow. He paused. Also a dam. I turned and looked at him. A small dam, he said, with the tone of a man who knew how that sounded and had made peace with it. And Cole was the decision maker for all of it. Or most of it. The dam was a separate situation. The dam had its own situation. I filed that away. Went back to watching Cole through the glass. He had stopped counting the light and was now looking at the table the same way he looked at walls, that single knock assessment, but he didn't knock because his hands were zip-tied to the chair arm, which someone had decided was necessary and which was going to be a point of contention when Graves arrived because Graves was precise about symbolism and zip ties on a staff sergeant in a review room said something he might not want said. Cole didn't seem bothered by the zip ties. That was the first thing that should have told me something. Graves arrived at 0509 and he was exactly what you expected an admiral to be if what you expected was an iceberg wearing a dress uniform. Tall. White-haired at the temples, dark everywhere else. The kind of man who had been the most dangerous person in every room he'd ever entered and had learned to stand still so others could pretend otherwise. He dismissed the MPs before he sat down. Harwick said, "Sir, protocol." "I didn't ask for protocol," Graves said, without raising his voice, without looking at Harwick, already moving toward the chair. "I asked for quiet." The MPs left. Graves sat. Put his hands flat on the table, fingers spread, not aggressive, just present, the way you put your hands down when you want someone to understand you are not reaching for anything. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back. 2 minutes passed. I counted. Harwick's knuckles went white around his coffee mug. The light flickered its 1.4 to 0.3 pattern 11 times. "Why are you here, Sergeant?" Graves said. Cole said nothing. "Not here in this room." "Here." doing this. A small gesture, encompassing nothing specific and, therefore, everything. Third rotation extended to 4. Volunteered for Oresh when 2 other NCOs declined. Refused medical evac in September. Filed to stay in country after your fire team was deactivated. Graves' voice was not accusatory. It was genuinely curious in the way that is more unsettling than accusation. Why? Cole looked at him for a long time. Then, he looked at his zip-tied wrists. "You're going to need to cut those," he said. His voice was the first time I'd heard it in 4 months, and it was exactly how I remembered it, flat, unhurried, with a scrape underneath like a boot on gravel. "If you want me to answer that question properly." Graves looked at the zip ties. Looked at Cole. Reached into his breast pocket and produced a small folding knife, the kind that cost more than most people's first cars, and cut them himself. Cole rolled his sleeves up. And the room changed. I felt it from behind the glass. Felt Harwick go still beside me in a way that was different from his previous stillness, the way a body goes still when the brain needs all available resources suddenly. Cole's forearms were laid flat on the table. Every scar had a story, and you could see that without knowing a single one of them. You could see it the way you can see that a wall has been through weather, the layering, the different vintages of damage, the old ones that had healed into smooth ridges and the ones not as old that were still negotiating with the skin around them. Not self-inflicted. A soldier knows the difference by sight after long enough. These were the record of a man who had been in the way of things that wanted to kill him for a long time and had declined, repeatedly, to cooperate. Graves looked at them. He didn't look away. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that changes the question he thought he was asking. "September," Cole said quietly. "The medical evac. You want to know why I filed to stay?" Graves said nothing, which meant yes. "I had 11 guys still in sector." Cole's voice didn't change. Didn't get heavier or more deliberate. Stayed flat, gravel scraped, matter of fact as a maintenance report. I knew the terrain. They didn't. The replacement team had 3 weeks in country. He paused. 1 beat. Not for effect, he wasn't a man who paused for effect. For precision. I made a calculation. And, the calculation was worth 63 casualties? The calculation at the time of the decision, Cole said, was made with the information available at the time of the decision. Graves was quiet. "Sir," Cole added, a single word dropped in like a stone into still water, neither respectful nor disrespectful, just present. I looked at Harwick. Harwick was looking at the ceiling tile, which was his version of my thigh tapping, the place you look when you're trying to keep your expression off your face. The review had been running 47 minutes. We had, as far as I could tell, not yet begun. What I remembered about Oresh wasn't what Harwick's summary had described. Harwick's summary was numbers, the 63, the 7 villages, the dam, the 2 years to rebuild the asset network. Harwick's summary was a ledger. What I remembered was the 3rd night in the valley when the QRF didn't come. We'd called it in. Twice. Clean signal, good coordinates, unambiguous contact report. And, for 41 minutes, on a ridgeline outside a village whose name I've since looked up in 6 different transliterations and still can't reliably spell, there was no cavalry. There was Cole. There was Cole and there were the 8 men he had and there was whatever decision tree was running behind those flat eyes while the rest of us were somewhere between prayer and controlled panic, which is not a peaceful place to be. He didn't make a speech. That is the thing I want to be precise about. In the version of events that gets told afterward, at the FOB, pass through the rotation grapevine, the story develops a speech. A moment. Cole says something definitive and rallying and everyone snaps into coherent action. That is not what happened. What happened was Cole got low, moved to Martinez, said 4 words I couldn't hear, then moved to Reyes, then to Diaz, and, by the time he'd made the circuit, 90 seconds, maybe less, something had shifted. Not morale. Not confidence, exactly. More like everyone had been handed a small specific job that was the right size for their hands, and the having of it was enough to hold back the other thing. The other thing being the very reasonable human understanding that we were exposed, outnumbered, and the QRF was 41 minutes late and counting. I don't know what he said to each of them. I know what he said to me. He got next to me close, shoulder to shoulder, the way you have to do when it's loud, and he said, "You count things. Count the muzzle flashes on the western slope. Tell me when you hit 12. That was it. That was the speech. I counted muzzle flashes. I hit 12 at the 6-minute mark. I told him. He relayed something to Martinez, something happened on the western slope that I didn't fully see, and the pressure on our position dropped by enough that we had options we hadn't had before. At some point the QRF arrived. At some other point it was over. I sat in the gravel afterward and my hands were doing the tapping thing on my own knee and I thought, he gave me something to count because he knew I needed something to count. Which was not a tactical decision. Which was something else that I didn't have a form number for. Behind the glass, Cole was still talking. Still flat, still precise, still the most unperformative person in a room built for performance. Graves was leaning forward slightly, not aggressive, not even consciously, just the physics of a man being pulled towards something interesting. I refilled my thermos. The new coffee was worse than the old coffee, which was an achievement. Harwick said, without looking away from the glass, he's not going to explain himself. No, I said. Graves is going to push him. Yes. And, Cole is going to, he stopped. Answer the question he's actually answering, I finished. Which is not the one Graves keeps asking. Harwick finally turned and looked at me. For the first time since Bugram he actually seemed to see me. What question is he answering? I looked at Cole through the glass. At the arms on the table. At the way he sat, not braced, not performing calm, but actually quiet in the way of a thing that has been through enough weather to stop anticipating it. The one Graves asked first, I said. Why he's here. He's been answering it since he sat down. Harwick didn't respond. The light flickered. 1.4 on. 0.3 off. I counted and thought about the 11 men who were alive in sector because a man with a mountain range of scars on his forearms had made a calculation. And I thought about what 63 meant. And I sat with both of those things and did not try to resolve them into a single answer, because Cole had not asked me to, and because some arithmetic doesn't simplify. End of part 1. Hashtag part 2 hashtag the geometry of what he did by 0600 the coffee was execrable and I had started on the granola bar from my jacket pocket, which tasted like compressed cardboard and obligation, and Admiral Graves had not moved from his chair except once to pour himself a glass of water that he also didn't drink. The glass sat next to his hands. Everyone in the room had a prop they weren't using. Nobody was thirsty. Everyone was stalling against something they couldn't name. Harwick had gone to make calls somewhere around 0530, the kind of calls you make in a corridor, half turned away, voice low, that are either very important or a sophisticated excuse to stop watching something uncomfortable. He'd been back for 20 minutes and hadn't said anything, which was its own kind of information. I kept my eyes on the glass. Not the drinking glass on the table in the review room. My thermos. I had started logging the rings of dried coffee on the inside of the cap, each one a different shade of brown dark roast, the motor oil stuff from Bugram, the almost reasonable cup from Ramstein Transit, and I was aware that I was doing this, aware it was the counting thing, aware that awareness was not the same as stopping. In the room, Graves had shifted approaches. He'd been at the tactical record for the first hour, the Oresh Valley decision tree, the exfil routes, the sequence of events that produced the body count and the dam and the compromised network. Cole had answered all of it with the effect of a man reading back maintenance logs, accurate, complete, emptied of everything that wasn't factual. Every answer was a form of the same sentence. Asterisk, this was the situation. This was the available information. This was the decision made on that information, asterisk, he didn't apologize and he didn't justify. He reported. Graves had the look of a man trying to find purchase on a glass wall. He changed. Walk me through September, Graves said. Not September the operation, September the evac. He was specific. He was pointing at the thing Cole had mentioned himself, the medical evac he'd filed against, the insector extension. Cole looked at him for a moment. I had a hairline fracture in the left tibia, he said. Compression. From a landing in week 2 of the rotation. It was manageable. The field surgeon's recommendation was made without full operational context, Cole said. Not combative. Factual, the way a weather report is factual. She didn't know what I knew about the replacement teams in country preparation. I did. You filed against a surgeon's recommendation to stay with 11 men. Yes, sir. With a fractured leg. Hairline, Cole said, with a precision that was so understated it functioned almost like humor, except Cole's face didn't change at all. Graves was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Does pain not register for you, Sergeant? And, Cole, for the first time in 90 minutes of talking, paused. Not a performance pause. Not the kind you make to seem thoughtful. The kind that means something caught. A small snag in the fabric of the conversation, almost invisible, that I almost missed because I was looking at my thermos rings. It registers, Cole said. And, moved on. Which was an entire confession and, Graves heard it. I heard it through the glass, 2 inches of reinforced panel away, and felt it like a barometric shift. The way the room before a storm goes still, not because the air stops moving but because it starts moving differently. Here is what I know about a resh that wasn't in Harwick's ledger. The valley ran northeast to southwest, about 9 kilometers. It had been contested, that specific category of contested that means nobody has it and everybody wants it, and the wanting has been going on long enough to become geological, to become part of the landscape for 2 decades before we arrived, and would be contested for, however, many more decades we weren't paying attention to. The villages weren't named on most of our maps. The maps we had were 6 years old and had been updated with a mix of satellite data and things that turned out to be optimistic. Cole had hand-drawn corrections on his. I'd seen them pencil, careful, annotated in a tiny print that was almost obsessively legible, the kind of writing that says I need to be able to read this in the dark, possibly while moving, possibly while my hands aren't entirely steady. The corrections dated back to his first rotation. Some of the annotations were in a second handwriting that wasn't his. Martinez told me, once, that the second handwriting was a guy named Okafor. I didn't ask what happened to Okafor. The way Martinez said the name was a complete sentence. Cole's map had a notation in the northeast corner, near the village we called Waypoint 7 for operational clarity and, which had a real name I knew how to approximate but won't put on paper here. The notation said, high ground east, concealment false, deceptive from approach, underlined twice. Little star. The kind of notation that means I learned this the expensive way. That notation saved us the first week. Reyes had been about to take a 4-man element up the east slope for observation. Cole looked at the map, looked at the slope, and moved the element 40 meters south to a scrub position that looked worse on paper and was in fact excellent. Reyes bitched about it for 2 days, until the 3rd day when a mortar position opened up from behind the concealment on the east slope exactly where his element would have been. Reyes stopped bitching. Cole didn't say anything about it. Not I told you, not good thing he noted the mortar position on the map in his small legible print, added a date, and continued. This is the thing about Cole that I struggled to put into Harwick's framework, which was a framework built for counting casualties and assessing decision trees and asking whether protocols had been followed. The thing that didn't fit. He was not brave in the performed sense. He was not the sergeant who gives the speech and charges the hill and becomes the story. He was the sergeant who looked at the hill 2 weeks before and wrote a note about it in small legible handwriting and then, when the moment came, moved the element 40 meters south and said nothing afterward because the point was the element being alive, not the credit for keeping them alive. That's a specific kind of person. It's not common. It does not submit neatly to a level 4 review. Graves had shifted again. This was his 3rd approach and I was beginning to understand that the approaches weren't randomness, they were a spiral, each one circling the same center, getting tighter. You had authority to abort, Graves said. Twice. The first was at the FOB, before the valley push. The intelligence picture had degraded. Your CO at the time, Major Whitfield. Cole supplied it without inflection. Whitfield had flagged the operation as amber caution. You could have stood down. Yes, sir. Why didn't you? Cole looked at him with something that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite its opposite. Something more like the flat regard you give a question you've answered before and will answer again because the person asking needs to hear it even though the hearing won't resolve what they think it will resolve. Because amber caution isn't a stand-down order, Cole said. It's information. Sergeant, the asset in Waypoint 3 had been running for 9 months. The network he'd built took 22 months before that to establish. If we stood down on amber caution, the window closed. The asset went dark or got burned. 2.5 years of work, gone. He paused. Not the catching pause, this time. Deliberate. Making sure Graves was tracking. The intel picture had degraded because there was a leak in the adjacent network. Not ours. Adjacent. The leak had been identified and cauterized 8 days prior. The amber flag was legacy. He said the last word like it had a taste he didn't care for. Whitfield hadn't updated his assessment because Whitfield was rotating out in 72 hours and was spending those 72 hours not getting killed. Harwick made a small sound beside me that might have been a suppressed cough or might have been something else. You're describing your commanding officer as operationally checked out, Graves said. I'm describing the situation as it was, Cole said. This, I thought, was going to appear in the report in a very edited form. And, the second abort option, Graves said. Day 4. When the QRF was 41 minutes late, Cole said. Yes, sir. You could have extracted to the secondary position. There was a viable route. For 6 of the 8 on the ridgeline. The secondary route couldn't support the 2 casualties we'd taken. You could have moved the casualties to the primary extract point first and, in approximately the time it would have taken to do that, Cole said, still flat, still gravel, the primary extract point would have been compromised. The contact we were in contact with was probing for it. They found it 40 minutes after we left the ridgeline. He looked at Graves. We weren't there anymore. Graves was quiet. I understand how it looks on the timeline, Cole said. It looks like I chose to stay engaged when I had an out. That is an accurate description of what I did. He didn't say but. He let it sit there. Graves said, and you'd make the same decision. I'd make the same decision on the same information, Cole said. Yes. Even knowing what it cost. Silence. The fluorescent tube flickered. 1.4 on. 0.3 off. Cole looked at his forearms, then, back at Graves. What it cost is in the record, sir. What it prevented isn't. What it prevented isn't. I wrote that in my log. Actual log, the small waterproof notebook I keep in my left breast pocket and fill with the things I need to remember and the things I can't afford to forget. I've been keeping the log since Kandahar, year 1. I'm on my 8th notebook. The handwriting in the early ones is different from the handwriting in the current one, which is something I've noticed and not examined closely. I wrote Cole's sentence and stared at it. This is the arithmetic I'd been refusing since Harwick gave me his ledger on the drive from the car to the building, the 63 against whatever number occupied the other side of the equation. The 11 men alive in sector. The asset network, intact. The villages that weren't Waypoint 7. The operations that ran after Oresh because the groundwork laid in Oresh held. You cannot put that number in a report. You can't put it in a level 4 review. It doesn't exist as data because it is composed entirely of things that didn't happen, which is the hardest kind of thing to count. I am someone who counts things. I could not count that. What I could count, Cole had been in country, across 4 rotations, for a total of 31 months. He had been recommended for medical rotation twice and declined both. He had filed 9 formal objections to operational decisions made above his rank, which is not 0 and is not nothing. He had been cited for commendation twice and investigated for conduct once, which was the investigation that preceded this review, which had been opened by a colonel who was not Harwick and who had, as far as I could tell, never been in a valley like Oresh in his life. The scars on Cole's forearms covered roughly the same period. That was not a coincidence. It was a record. A ledger of a different kind, not body counts and compromised exfil routes, but the running total of what a man absorbs when he keeps making the same decision over and over again, the decision to be present, to be the one who stays, to write the note on the map in small legible handwriting and move the element 40 meters south and say nothing afterward. Graves was looking at the forearms again. Not for the first time in the review. He'd looked at them at the beginning, when Cole first laid them flat, and then had proceeded with the questioning as if he hadn't, which is a technique I recognized. You file it, you use it later, you don't let the subject know what moved you. But he was looking at them now in a different way. The way you look at something that has rearranged the question you came in with. How old are you, Sergeant? Graves asked. 34, sir. Graves nodded, once, as if 34 explained something and also made something worse simultaneously. What does your family think about the extensions, he said. And that was the question that finally got a reaction. Not a large one. You would have missed it if you weren't trained to look for it and also trained to count things, which I was, which meant I caught the quarter second where Cole's jaw shifted, a small micro-adjustment, the kind of muscular tell that happens before a person decides how they're going to answer something they did not prepare for. I don't have, he stopped. Start it again. There's no one waiting on my return, sir. Graves said nothing. That's not. Cole stopped again. Rarer. He had not stopped mid-sentence once in the previous 90 minutes. I'm not saying it as a liability. I'm saying it as a fact of the situation. I know, Graves said. Quiet. Not sympathetic, not the performed sympathy of a superior trying to seem human. Just, I know. I heard it, the light flickered. Cole looked at his hands. And, for the first time since they'd brought him into the room, he looked like someone who was tired. Not broken. Not performing tiredness for effect. The actual thing. The kind that lives behind the eyes where the flat gravel voice can't reach. It lasted 4 seconds. Then, it was gone and he was back, present, careful, reporting. But I had logged it. 0622 hours. I had logged it. Harwick spoke for the first time in 40 minutes. Low, not looking away from the glass. He's not going to give Graves what he needs for the report. What does the report need? A reason. Justification that fits in a box. Harwick set his mug down, finally, on the narrow ledge below the observation window. Something that explains why a senior NCO made 17 consecutive unilateral decisions during a 6-week operation that resulted in 63 casualties and a dam. The dam still bothers you. The dam is a navigable waterway now, Carver. It didn't used to be. I looked at him. Small dam, he said, again, with the same resignation. He already gave him the reason, I said. He gave it in the first 20 minutes. The 11 men, the asset network, the operational window. The information available at the time of the decisions. That's not a reason that fits in a box. No, I said. The review board is going to want. I know what the review board is going to want. Harwick picked his mug back up. Didn't drink. You were there, he said. You're the contextualization witness. When they put you in that room, you're going to have to decide what you tell them. I looked at Cole through the glass. At the forearms. At the small legible handwriting of a man who wrote notes on maps because he needed to be able to read them in the dark. At the tired thing behind his eyes that lasted 4 seconds and, then, was filed away. I know, I said. And I wrote 0622 hours in my notebook and tapped 3 times on the inside of my thigh under the observation ledge, soft, rhythmic, and thought about everything I had counted since they'd pulled me out of cost. 31 months in country. 9 formal objections. 11 men in sector. 1 dam. 8 notebooks. 41 minutes the QRF was late. I kept the tapping going. Kept counting. End of part 2 *@ 0641 Graves asked for a 10-minute recess and the MPs outside the door came back in and Cole looked at his re-zip-tied wrists with an expression that was not anger and was not resignation and was something that lived in the narrow country between the two, but country Cole had apparently been a citizen of for long enough to have established residency. I went out into the corridor and drank bad coffee from the machine by the stairwell and stood next to Harwick, who was also standing next to bad coffee, and neither of us said anything for a while, which was the most honest conversation we'd had since Bagram. There was a window at the end of the corridor. Outside it was beginning to get light, the specific grey pink of a European dawn, the kind that looks like something trying very hard not to be as cold as it is. A flight line was visible in the distance. A C-130 running pre-flight checks, its anti-collision light strobing red-white-red in the low cloud. I counted the strobe intervals. Harwick said, "Graves is going to recommend a conditional discharge." I stopped counting. Based on what? The conduct investigation's findings. 17 unilateral decisions outside the chain of command. Insubordination, technically. The board can frame it that way. The board can also frame it as what, Carver? Harwick wasn't sharp about it. He was tired about it, which was worse. A man who was right? That's not a box the review process has. Right or wrong isn't the question. Authorization is the question. Cole made decisions he wasn't authorized to make. 63 times. A beat. 64 if you count the dam. The dam was a judgment call on everything, was a judgment call. That is the problem. He drank his coffee. Made a face. Put it in the waste bin. You're going in after the recess. I looked at him. Graves requested you specifically. He had your Oresh debrief pulled and he wants to hear the Ridgeline account firsthand. Harwick looked at me with the same calibration he'd used at the door when I arrived. That measurement of useful versus liability. You're going to tell him what you saw? Yes, sir. All of it? Yes, sir. He held the look for 2 more seconds and then looked away. Back at the flight line. The C-130's strobes. Cole's going to hear whatever you say, Harwick said. Room like that, he'll hear it. I know. Make sure you know that. I finished my coffee and went back down the corridor and didn't look at my notebook and didn't tap my thigh and didn't count anything. They put me in the review room at 0702. No glass between me and the table this time, the real room, the actual chairs, the actual fluorescent tube with its 1.4 to 0.3 rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat over our heads. Cole was across the table. His wrists had been cut again, Graves had done it himself. Same knife, same quiet practicality, and his arms were back on the table. He looked at me when I sat down the way he'd always looked at things, asking the wall's permission. Just once. Taking the measure. I nodded at him. He didn't nod back. He didn't look away either. He just continued looking, neutral, which was Cole's version of acknowledgement. Graves said, "Lieutenant Carver. You were on the ridgeline at waypoint 7 on the night of October 14th. Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Cole was your fire team lead. Yes, sir. Walk me through the decision to hold position rather than extract. So I did. I told it flat, the way I'd learned to tell things from watching Cole tell things, stripped of editorializing, stripped of the performed objectivity that isn't objectivity at all, just the feelings you have about what you're describing dressed up in uniform language. I told it as a sequence of moments, each one the size it actually was. The QRF being 41 minutes late. The 2 casualties. The secondary extract route that couldn't support them. The contact probing for the primary point. Cole's assessment, communicated in the 90 seconds he'd spent moving person to person. The shift that happened after. What happened to the primary extract point 40 minutes after we left it? Graves listened. Cole listened. I got to the part about counting the muzzle flashes and I felt Cole's attention change, not physically, he didn't move, but it was like a change in air pressure, that quarter-millimeter shift you feel before weather, and I kept going. He gave me something to count, I said. Because he knew I needed something to count. Silence. That's not in your written debrief, Graves said. No, sir. Why not? I looked at the table. Because I didn't know how to log it. Graves was quiet for a moment. Then, and you're logging it now? Yes, sir. Cole was looking at the tabletop. Nowhere specific. The kind of looking you do when you're not looking at anything. Graves turned slightly in his chair. Not toward Cole, not away, a reorientation that acknowledged the three of us were in a different conversation than the one the review had been designed for. Sergeant Cole, Graves said. Let me ask you something outside the record. Cole looked up. You knew the 11 men on your team would be compromised without you. You knew the replacement team's in-country preparation was insufficient. You knew the evac would pull you out before you could transfer what you knew about the valley to whoever came next. Graves' voice was the same temperature it had been for 2 hours, even, unhurried, pulling no punches by pretending to. You made a calculation. Yes, sir. And, the calculation was, I am the information. Silence. Not Cole's flat professional silence. Something else. Yes, sir, he said. And, that was it. 2 words that sat on the table like something physical and heavy, and nobody moved to pick them up. I've thought about that sentence for a long time since. I am the information. Not I had the information. Not I knew things they didn't. The specific verb. Am. The specific subject. Not the maps with their pencil corrections, not the 31 months of valley topography and village names and concealment that is false from the approach loaded into a brain that had been present through all of it. The man. The accumulation. The thing that cannot be helicoptered out and handed to a replacement team in a manila folder. This is not something the review process has a box for. This is not something most people who haven't been somewhere like Oresh can fully hold. I have been trying to find the language for it since October, and the closest I've gotten is this: there are places that eat people. Not dramatically. Not in the movie sense of a place that breaks you or destroys you. Slowly. Consistently. The way a river erodes rock, not by violence but by persistence, by the simple insistence of being there every day for long enough. Oresh was that kind of place. And Cole had learned Oresh the only way you learn a place like that. By being in it when it was doing what it did. By absorbing it through the skin, which is why the skin looked the way it did. He was the information because the information lived nowhere else. Harwick's ledger said 63. That number was real. It was not the whole number. There is no form for the whole number. At 0751 Graves adjourned the review. He didn't announce a finding. Didn't give any indication of what the report would say or what he was taking to the board or what recommendation would land on whichever desk eventually received it. He closed his folder, capped his pen, stood. He looked at Cole for a long moment. Not the assessment look he'd arrived with. Something that had replaced it over the course of the morning, that I didn't have a word for either, that was in the same country as the space between anger and resignation but was a different territory. Quieter. He said, you'll remain in facility pending the board review. 48 hours maximum. Yes, sir, Cole said. Graves picked up the drinking glass he'd never drunk from. Looked at it, as if surprised to find it in his hand. Set it back down. He left. The MPs came in. Zip-tied Cole's wrists again. Cole looked at his wrists and did the thing where he assessed them, the knuckle knock against the chair arm, and I thought, he's checking if the restraints are real. Not because he's planning anything. Because it's the habit. Because after 31 months in places where things needed to be verified, you verify things. He looked at me before they took him out. You counted right, he said. Which meant, the muzzle flashes. October. The ridgeline. You counted 12 and, you told me, and it mattered. I counted right, I said. They took him out. I sat in the review room for a while after. The light kept doing its 1.4 to 0.3. My thermos was empty and the coffee machine in the corridor was out of everything, which felt about right. Harwick came in at some point and sat down in Graves' chair. He looked wrong in it, too tired, too rumpled, lacking Graves' capacity to make furniture look like it was lucky to be sat in. He's not getting discharged, Harwick said. I looked at him. Graves called the board chair before he left the building. I don't know what he said. I know the conduct review is being reclassified. He paused. I don't know what it's being reclassified to. Commendation review? I said, which I knew was probably wrong. Something else, Harwick said, which told me nothing and everything. He looked at the table. At the indentations where Cole's arms had rested on it for 2 hours. Not visible exactly, not marks, not scars on the furniture, but I looked at where they had been and saw them anyway, the way you see the shape of something that's been removed. What are you going to log? Harwick asked. I opened my notebook. The tapping was going under the table, 3 fingers, soft. I wrote the time. I wrote what Graves had said. I wrote I am the information and underlined it once. I wrote, the arithmetic doesn't simplify. Then, I stopped writing and sat with the light and the empty thermos and the shape of where Cole's arms had been on the table and thought about Okafor, whose handwriting I had seen and whose name I had never asked about, and about the men on the ridgeline who were a live insector because of an assessment made on a map with a pencil and a small legible print and 2 underlines and a star. And I thought about the 11. And the 63. And sat with both. 3 days later they put Cole back in sector. Not Oresh. Different valley. Same country. The orders came through channels I wasn't cleared for and landed as a fact, a datum, the way most things land when the decision has already been made somewhere above the level of paperwork. Martinez told me. Flat voice, like he'd been expecting it, which he had, which was the thing about Martinez, he always knew the shape of what was coming before the shape arrived. Graves? I asked. Martinez shrugged. Above Graves, maybe. The board doesn't send people back in sector, Martinez said. The board closes cases. He picked up his bolt carrier and went back to cleaning it and I understood that the conversation was over. I wrote it in my notebook. Time, date, fact. Cole, in sector, New Valley. I did not write down what I thought about it, which is a policy I've maintained since Notebook 3, when I wrote down what I thought about something and it turned out to be wrong in ways that were expensive. I wrote the fact. The valley's name. The date. I looked at the date for a while. Then, I looked at my hands, which had stopped tapping, which was something that happened sometimes and which I never trusted. The report, when I received my copy 3 weeks later, was 27 pages. It covered the Oresh operation from initial deployment through the events of October 14 and the subsequent 6 days. It covered the 63, the 7 villages, the 2 exfil routes, the asset network, the dam. It covered Cole's decision-making sequence and the clinical architectural language of Level 4 reviews, authorized action, unauthorized action, outcome assessment, chain of command analysis, recommendations. I read all 27 pages. My name appeared 4 times. Twice in the Ridgeline account, once as contextual witness designation, once in the appendix, which was shorthand, classified at a level above the main document, which was not standard. I read the main document twice. I did not have clearance for the appendix. I thought about what Harwick had said. Something else. What the reclassification had become. I thought about Cole in a different valley. Same country. Same habits, probably, the wall knock, the small legible handwriting, the 90-second circuit giving each person a job the right size for their hands. I thought about the new replacement team and whether their in-country preparation was sufficient. I did not have data on that. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. Wrote the date. Wrote, Cole, in sector. Wrote, the information goes with him. Stared at it for a while. I still don't know what Graves said to the board chair. I still don't know what's in the appendix. What I know is that the review room at Ramstein has a fluorescent tube that flickers 1.4 on and 0.3 off and a table with no visible marks on it that I still look at when I think about that morning. What I know is that why are you here is a question with teeth. What I know is that some arithmetic doesn't simplify no matter how long you sit with it, and the sitting is what you're supposed to do, and I've been doing it in this notebook, in small careful handwriting, trying to get the record right. Trying to get the record right. Because Cole was right about one thing, above all the things he was right about in that room, what it cost is in the record. What it prevented isn't. And someone has to keep counting. End of part 3. END